Close your eyes if you like. Take a deep breath. Now imagine yourself in a dank 14th century tavern, where the air is thick with smoke, and the smell of fermenting beer mingles with the smell of bodies that haven't tasted soap in weeks. You climb a creaky wooden staircase, enter a dark room, and find yourself on a simple-looking bed made of rough wood and a mattress of hay. You lie down. Hay creaks beneath you. Something is moving beneath the woolen blanket. Maybe a mouse. Maybe something smaller, but with more legs. Welcome to the medieval bed. Today, your sheets are clean, your mattress is orthopedic, and your home is well sealed against insects. But 700 years ago, the simple act of lying down was a risky experience. Sleeping was not a guaranteed rest. It was a journey between bites, itches, coughs, and a whisper of fever that might not go away. Forget comfort, forget privacy, forget even the feeling of being alone in the room. Because in the Middle Ages, the mattress was not just yours. If you've ever been bothered by mosquitoes in your bedroom, imagine waking up with dozens of fleas jumping under your skin, with bedbugs hiding in your rags waiting for the right moment to suck your blood, and with lice living in your hair and blanket, with no intention of leaving. The noise you heard at night, it wasn't the wind. It was the gnawing of mice on the baseboard. It was the dry sound of tiny paws crossing your pillow. It was the world of the invisible, occupying the most intimate place in the human body, the bed. Maybe you've never wondered about the sound of an infested mattress. But now, I invite you to listen with your heart, listen with your skin, and feel, even centuries later, what it was like to sleep in a time when dirt was not the exception, it was the rule. And don't think we're talking about one of oversight or a poorer family. The logic of dirt was structural. Hygiene was a cultural, not just a matter of resources. The very notion of cleanliness was different. Dirt stuck like a second skin. The stench was a common prison, almost a personal signature. And within this, the bed became an extension of the body and also a battlefield for what lived in and around it. Back then, the concept of intimate space was blurred. Beds were shared by siblings, parents, guests, and servants. Sometimes with animals, and always with insects. A bedspread was never just a bedspread. It was a community, a shelter for lice eggs, a blanket that breathed, itched, and sometimes bled. Is it hard to imagine? Then don't imagine. Feel it. Feel the rough touch of a sheet that hasn't seen water in months. Feel the smell of damp wool and dried urine. Feel the strange heat that moves in the night that doesn't come from your body. And perhaps now you will begin to understand why medieval beds were not places of rest. They were arenas, nighttime trenches where the body tried to rest and, at the same time, survive. Where sleep was interrupted not by nightmares, but by bites. Where fevers would flare up the next day, and no one knew why. Where constant itching was normalized, and where a child who fell asleep healthy could wake up sick, or not wake up at all. This is the universe we are going to delve into today. At each stage of this video, you will discover what lived between the blankets and rags. You will meet the invisible tenants of the medieval night. You will feel the despair of a sleep interrupted by parasites, the anguish of not understanding what caused the wound, the chronic discomfort of living in an environment that was never clean enough to be safe. You will discover that even the simplest gesture of lying down to sleep was a risk. And more than that, it was a metaphor, because the medieval bed was not just a physical place. It was a symbol, a reflection of everyday life, improvised, shared, infested with small and constant problems that no one could completely eradicate. So, get ready. The medieval night is about to begin. And if you dare, lie down. But be careful of what will sting you. Picture this. You step into a medieval cottage at dusk. The hearth glows faintly. The smell of damp earth clings to the walls. In the corner, a bed awaits. It is not the kind of bed you know. No springs, no memory foam. Just a frame of rough wood, lashed together, and stuffed with the kind of things you might expect to find in a barn. Straw, hay, wool, dried leaves, old cloth, scraps of burlap. These were the ingredients of sleep in the Middle Ages. But they were not just bedding. They were invitations to life you did not ask to share your nights with. The straw rustled softly when someone lay down, but not always because of movement. Sometimes something else was moving. Fleas and lice, embedded deep in the layers. Beetles that scurried away from the heat of your body. Mites that thrived in the dust and dander collected over weeks, sometimes months, without cleaning. Straw mattresses, known as pallias, were affordable and easy to make. But straw decomposes. It flattens, it molds, it attracts moisture and warmth, which are perfect breeding grounds for all manner of. And as the straw broke down, it released an earthy, rotting smell that clung to the air. It was not unusual for people to sprinkle herbs or ashes on top to mask the stench, but that only masked It never truly cleansed. Now imagine the sensation of lying on such a mattress. The sharp edges of stalks pressing into your back, the itchy texture of burlap against your skin, the occasional twitch on your leg that was not your imagination, and when you shifted in your sleep, a sudden tiny bite, then another, then dozens. Wool was sometimes used as a more luxurious filler, but even that had its flaws. If not properly cleaned or carded, wool could carry remnants of the sheep itself, grease, flecks of dirt, even mites from the fleece. Once it became damp with sweat, the wool would clump and stink, holding onto body odor and becoming heavy with time. In rural homes, the idea of washing bedding was almost foreign. Water had to be fetched from wells or rivers, and soap was costly or homemade. Priorities leaned towards survival, not sanitation. And so, the mattress became a microcosm of everything the body shed and everything nature crept in with. Some beds were simply sacks of cloth stuffed with anything soft enough to lie on, but those sacks were rarely emptied or refreshed. Over time, they transformed into dense, moist cushions of decay, absorbing everything from body fluids to spilled food to the lingering scent of illness. And then there were the sounds. The crackling of hay shifting beneath you, the whisper of straw against skin, the unmistakable rustle that was not caused by you. It was alive, it was constant, and it was normal. Even in castles, where the rich slept on feather beds and thick fabrics, infestations were common. Feathers carried their own pests, and without knowledge of hygiene, changing or airing out bedding was more symbolic than effective. A bed was decorated, perfumed, and draped in silks, but beneath all that grandeur, the same crawl of unseen legs continued. Children, especially, were vulnerable. Their small bodies offered more warmth and easier access. They cried in the night, scratching at their arms and legs, often blamed for being restless or sickly. But the truth was simpler and more painful. They were being bitten, over and over, by creatures that thrived where warmth, filth, and darkness met. The connection between material and parasite was rarely understood. People accepted that sleeping meant itching, that skin eruptions were a part of life, that a bad night's sleep might be followed by fever or rash. These discomforts were not questioned, they were endured. Today, a bed is a place of safety, a refuge. In medieval times, it was just another risky place in a world that already offered to few comfort. Every night, the straw would sigh under your weight, and every night it would wake the things that slept with you. This was the reality of rest in the Middle Ages. A mattress was not just a bed, it was a nest, and not only for you. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a room where the walls are made of stone and the floor is backed dirt. There is a single candle flickering in the corner, and outside, the night groans with wind and distant howls. You pull your blanket tighter, but it does not offer comfort, because somewhere in the darkness you hear it again. The scratching, the chewing, the tiny, determined feet moving beneath your bed. Rats were not just visitors in medieval homes. They were resident, permanent, unwanted, and inescapable. Their presence was not rare, it was expected. Many medieval homes doubled as storage spaces for grain, firewood, dried meat, and cloth. These items attracted pests like magnets. Rats, in particular, were drawn to the warmth and food. And where better to find both than near the beds of humans who exhaled warmth and slept beside sacks of grain. Beds were often built low to the ground, straw or hay mattresses that offered perfect hiding places. Rats burrowed into them, nested in, and sometimes even gnawed through them. In some cases, people would wake up to find the corners of their blankets torn, their provisions chewed through, or worse, their own skin bit. Children were especially vulnerable. Small and still in their sleep, they were often mistaken by hungry rodents for easy prey. There are records and oral accounts of babies found with tiny wounds on their fingers and toes, victims of nighttime foraging. Some believed these bites were spiritual punishments or curses. Few suspected the real culprits were small, furry creatures hiding just out of sight. The line between human and rodent spaces was thin. In poor rural cottages, animals roamed freely. Cats, when present, were a deterrent, but they were not in every household. And many families believed cats were bad omens, choosing instead to let the rats be. The most disturbing part was the normalization of this coexistence. People accepted that rats might run across their feet at night, that the bread left near the bedside might be gone by morning, that strange noises were not ghosts but rodents, nibbling away at the corners of their lives. Rats were not only a source of discomfort, they were deadly. The fleas they carried were vectors of disease, most infamously the bubonic plague. A single flea bite could become a death sentence. Entire villages were decimated, and yet the source often remained invisible to them. People blamed the stars, the air, or divine punishment. Few looked to the beds, where fleas jumped from rat to human in the quiet of the night. The smell was also unforgettable. Rat urine has a sharp, acrid odor. It soaked into bedding, mixed with the scent of moldy straw, and clung to the damp stone walls. That smell became part of the medieval night, something you breathed in as you tried to fall asleep. Efforts to keep rats out were desperate and mostly ineffective. People laid traps, scattered herbs, or hung sharp objects from their ceilings. None of it worked for long. The rats were smart, fast, and endlessly resourceful. In wealthier homes, the problem was masked but not absent. Food was stored in cellars, and servants were tasked with chasing vermin away. Yet even in castles, rats found their way into the kitchens, into the servants' quarters, and into the feather beds of nobles who imagined themselves safe. There are even medieval illustrations showing people sleeping with rats running across their chests. Artists of the time often exaggerated for symbolic reason, but in this case, they were not far from the truth. Rat infestations were a part of life, a part of sleep, and a part of fear. And still, people laid down each night, knowing the risk, knowing that at any moment they might feel a tail brush against their leg, or wake to the sound of something chewing into their head. Sleep was not sacred in the Middle Ages. It was survival. And sharing a bed with rats was just another test of that fragile, nightly ritual. So the next time you fluff your pillow and slide under clean sheets, remember this. For many centuries, sleep came with the scratching of claws and the weight of fear. And sometimes the most terrifying thing in the dark was not a nightmare. It was real. It had teeth, and it was already in the bed. Imagine settling into bed after a long, exhausting day. The candle has burned low, casting shadows that twitch across the walls. You lay your head down, pull the covers over your body, and close your eyes. But instead of peace, you feel it. A tiny prick, then another, and another. It is not a blanket. It is not the mattress. It is them, the fleas, and they are everywhere. In the medieval world, fleas were not simply a nuisance. They were a way of life. Their presence was so common, so persistent that people spoke of them with resignation, not alarm. These tiny creatures were the true rulers of the medieval night, slipping through seams and sleeping among the folds of cloth, feasting on human blood with silent efficiency. Fleas thrived in the exact conditions that medieval homes provided. Warmth, darkness, filth. Bedding was rarely washed. Mattresses were filled with straw, wool, or moss that had not been replaced for months, sometimes years. Clothing was worn repeatedly without laundering. Hair and skin were rarely scrubbed clean. And in this environment, fleas found paradise. They laid their eggs in the softest places, in the folds of cloaks tossed over the bed, in the seams of shirts, in the corners of pillows. A single flea could lay up to 50 eggs in one day, and when those eggs hatched, they slipped into the smallest cracks, waiting for the warmth of a sleeping body. People often went to bed fully dressed. This was partly for warmth, but also for protection. It was common to sleep wearing socks, long tunics, or even gloves and caps, not just because of the cold, but because bare skin meant easy access. Fleas would crawl up the legs, nestle into armpits, and congregate along the neck. The most intimate parts of the body were the most vulnerable. Medieval writings occasionally mention fleas in passing, as if they were a simple fact of existence. There were prayers jokingly aimed at them, poems describing their bites, even love letters, where a flea bite was romanticized as a mark of shared experience. That is how normalized they were. The bites were not always minor. For some, they caused intense itching, swelling, and even infection. Scratching led to sores, and those sores could fester. In an era without antibiotics or antiseptic creams, a simple flea bite could spiral into something more dangerous. And then there was the real danger. Fleas were the silent carriers of death. The infamous Black Death, which wiped out a third of Europe, spread in part because of fleas. The fleas traveled on rats, jumped to humans, and delivered the plague through their bites. A single bite could lead to fever, delirium, and death within days. In homes across Europe, entire families would fall ill one after another. Beds became graves, and yet the fleas lived on, jumping to the next home, the next bed, the next warm body. Despite this, most people did not link fleas to disease. They did not understand how the plague spread. They blamed the air, the water, the wrath of God. But all along, it was the quiet whisper of wings and the soft tickle of legs. Efforts to remove fleas were desperate and crude. Some rubbed garlic or vinegar on their skin. Others wore sachets of herbs around their necks or placed lavender in their bedding. Sometimes people even rolled themselves in flour or ashes to suffocate the insect. But nothing truly worked. There were no screens on windows, no sprays, no knowledge of how to break the breeding cycle. Fleas came and went as they pleased. They owned the bed. The humans were just temporary guests. Even in monasteries and noble households, the presence of fleas was inescapable. Silk and velvet offered no protection. In fact, the thicker the fabric, the more places fleas had to hide. Servants were tasked with brushing and shaking linens, but without washing, the infestation always returned. And the most unsettling part, you could feel them, crawling, jumping, biting. In the middle of the night, people would wake up scratching furiously. Some developed rituals, like beating the mattress before lying down or placing their bedding near firelight. But by then, the fleas were already nestled in. The psychological toll was real. Sleep became anxious. People dreaded the nighttime itching. Children cried in the dark, and adults bore red welts that never seemed to disappear. Sleep was not rest. It was a nightly negotiation with an invisible enemy. So when you tuck yourself into night and feel the clean fabric on your skin, take a moment to be grateful. You are not in a world where tiny creatures crawl from your socks to your scalp. You are not sharing your bed with thousands of silent hunters. You are not scratching until you bleed, hoping for morning light. But in the Middle Ages, that was the price of sleep. And for many, it was a price paid every single night. There is a particular silence that falls in the middle of the night. The kind where even your breathing feels loud. It is in that silence that they come. You do not hear them. You do not see them. But your skin knows. Because bedbugs, unlike fleas or rats, are masters of timing. They wait. They wait for the moment you finally surrender to sleep. In the medieval bed, bedbugs were not an occasional pest. They were regular residents. They lived deep within the cracks of wooden bed frames, behind wall tapestry, inside mattress seams, and under pillows that were never washed. Entire colonies slept just inches away from your face, motionless until your body heat signaled that it was time. Unlike fleas, bedbugs do not jump. They crawl, slowly, silently, with a deliberate purpose. Drawn by carbon dioxide and warmth, they made their way to exposed skin and fed. Their bites were not immediately painful. Instead, they left behind itchy welts and trails of irritation that revealed their presence only hours later. People often woke with strange red patterns on their arms or necks. At first, they blamed food, weather, or curses. But as the days went on and the patterns returned, they began to understand something was feeding on them. Because of their flat bodies and stealthy behavior, bedbugs were nearly impossible to detect until the infestation was advanced. And even then, most people did not have the resources or knowledge to identify or remove them. Medieval homes were built with materials that invited insects. Wooden beams cracked with age. Woven walls and thatched roofs created countless hiding spots. When people brought in old clothing or reused bedding from family members or second-hand market, they often carried bedbugs with them. These insects moved from town to town, house to house, bed to bed. Bedbug infestations were not limited to the poor. Even noble families, with their carved oak furniture and layered fabrics, suffered. Their elaborate beds, draped in velvet and linen, were ideal habitat. In fact, the richer the bedding, the more places the insects had to live. To make matters worse, people did not associate bedbugs with filth in the way modern society. They did not think to wash or change bedding often. And when they did attempt to clean, it was usually with smoke or herbs. They might hang lavender or mint near the bed, hoping the scent would drive the insects away. But bedbugs are stubborn. They would retreat deeper into the furniture and return as soon as the herbs lost their power. Stories from the time speak of people scratching until they bled, unable to sleep from irritation. Some would sleep sitting up to avoid being bitten on the face. Others would abandon their beds altogether, opting for hard benches or even floors where the bugs had not yet spread. Children were particularly vulnerable. Their thin skin and small size made them easy targets. A child could wake crying from the discomfort, covered in bites, unable to explain why sleep had turned into suffering. The psychological effects were just as damaging. Imagine dreading bedtime, knowing that the moment you closed your eyes, you would become a meal. The anxiety of sleep, the helplessness of knowing that no matter what you did, the bugs would come. Even when people realized their beds were infested, their options were limited. Furniture was expensive. Mattresses were handmade. Burning or discarding an entire bed was unthinkable for most. Instead, people tried to chase the bugs out with smoke or expose the bedding to sunlight. These methods helped for a short time, but they never truly solved the problem. There were even superstitions built around bedbugs. Some believed they were a punishment for sins. Others thought they were sent by enemies or witches. These beliefs gave the bugs an almost mythical power, turning them from simple pests into agents of suffering and shame. But at their core, bedbugs were just survivors. They had adapted perfectly to the medieval world. They needed no light, made no noise, and could go for weeks without feeding. Their resilience made them almost invincible. So while people fought with herbs and smoke, bedbugs simply waited, hidden, patient, ready. If you have ever been bitten by one in modern times, you know the feeling, the itch that will not stop, the tiny raised bump that stays for days, the sense that your bed, your sanctuary, has been invaded. Now imagine that every night, for years, with no mattress protector, no spray, no escape. In the Middle Ages, the bed was not a retreat, it was a battlefield, and the enemy was small, silent, and always watching. Close your eyes and try to imagine the sensation of lying down after a day without washing. Your skin still holds the sweat of hours spent working in the fields, walking through muddy streets, or tending animals. The fabric against your body is the same you wore yesterday, and the day before, and perhaps even longer. This is not a race situation in the medieval world. This is normal. Bathing was not a daily habit for most people in the Middle Ages. It was a luxury, a ritual, or in some places, a suspicion. For some, it was a matter of faith. Religious teachings warned that exposing the naked body too often could invite temptation. For others, it was simply impractical. Clean water was scarce. Soap was expensive or made at home in small batches. Heating water took time, firewood, and labor. Because of this, medieval bodies carried layers of sweat, oils, dust, and more. This grime accumulated daily and was rarely scrubbed away. The skin became a canvas for salt, soot, and the invisible bacteria that grew in dark, warm creases. And at night, this entire layer of filth was transferred to the bed. Bedding was rarely washed. Mattresses were never soaked or replaced. The concept of deep cleaning did not exist as it does today. Instead, people might shake out the covers or beat the mattress with a stick. This did little to remove the build-up of skin flakes, body oils, dried saliva, and sometimes blood or pus from infected bites or wounds. The result was a sleeping environment rich in organic material. For insects, this was ideal. The bed became not only a warm, dark place to hide, but a constant buffet of skin cells and moisture. Fleas, lice, mites, and bedbugs flourished in these conditions. They were not just attracted to the person sleeping. They were also drawn to the residue the person left behind. Clothing followed the same pattern. Undergarments were worn repeatedly without washing. Socks, tunics, and even cloaks carried layers of sweat and dirt. These clothes were often used as blankets, and in colder seasons, people slept fully clothed. Every fibre was soaked in human scent and particles that encouraged infestation. Children were particularly affected. Unable to bathe themselves and often neglected in hygiene, their beds became reservoirs of grime and pest. Infants wrapped in swaddling clothes remained in the same bindings for days, sometimes longer. The accumulation of waste and heat created breeding grounds for rashes, infections, and parasite infestation. Even among the wealthy, where access to bathing was more available, the idea of regular cleanliness was not widespread. Perfume, herbs, and scented oils were used to mask odors rather than eliminate them. People might wash their faces and hands before meals, but full body cleansing was infrequent. In fact, many believed that water could weaken the body or open the skin to disease. This fear discouraged even those who could afford to bathe. The connection between dirt and illness was not yet understood. Disease was blamed on bad air, imbalance of humors, or divine punishment. Nobody imagined that the thick film covering their skin could be the very thing attracting insects and transmitting infection. The psychological toll was subtle but real. People were used to being itchy. They accepted boils, sores, and strange rashes as a part of life. Sleep was disturbed by scratching. Skin was irritated to the point of breaking. Yet this was not seen as a problem with the environment. It was simply the body doing what bodies did. When visitors stayed in someone else's bed, they brought their own layer of grime and their own invisible passengers. Beds were shared by family members, travelers, and servants. The exchange of bodily dirt was constant, creating a complex web of contamination. Without modern concepts of sanitation, the medieval world was a place of constant exposure. Every surface, every garment, every bed carried the mark of human presence. And this presence, left unchecked, became an invitation to suffering. So when we look at a medieval bed, we are not just seeing wood, straw, or cloth. We are seeing years of unwashed bodies, nights of unbroken sweat, and a culture that lived in harmony with its own filth, not by choice, but by necessity, by belief, or by survival. And in that layer of dirt, the insects found their kingdom, a place where they could feed, breed, and remain undisturbed. Tonight, when you wash your face or change your sheets, remember what that ritual really means. It is not just comfort. It is defense. A quiet war you are no longer fighting. but that others once last every single night. Try to picture a small wooden room, dimly lit by a dying fire. There is one bed, not a large one, not a soft one, but the only one. A mother lies on one side, an infant pressed to her chest. Next to her, a father with dust still clinging to his beard. At their feet, two children curled tightly beneath a thin wool blanket. And on the far edge, a visiting cousin, shoes still on, snoring gently. One bed, 6 bodies, breathing, sweating, shifting. In the medieval world, sharing a bed was common, not optional. Space was limited, and so were resources. Beds were expensive, rooms were few, firewood was scarce. Sharing body heat was not just practical, it was survival. And with this closeness came consequences that no one spoke about, yet everyone felt. When multiple bodies slept in a single bed, the warmth they generated created the perfect environment for parasites. Fleas and bedbugs thrived in the combined heat and moisture. Lice moved easily from head to head. Mites, hidden in the fibers of woolen blanket, found new hosts with every shift and shuffle. Intimacy was not always a choice. Children shared beds with siblings and parents. Servants often slept at the feet of their masters. Travelers were welcomed into homes and invited to sleep beside strangers. The proximity of skin, fabric, and breath turned every bed into a mixing chamber of bacteria, sweat, and infestation. In this environment, personal hygiene mattered little. Even if one person was clean, the others were not, and the insects did not discriminate. They moved across bodies freely, biting one, nesting in another, breeding beneath the shed sheets. There are records of families where entire households suffered from skin condition, rash-covered arms, open sores, constant scratching. But these symptoms were rarely traced back to the bed. They were blamed on dire, sin, or curses. No one suspected that the root cause might be beneath their very bodies as they slept. The emotional toll was also severe. Privacy was non-existent. The smell of breath, the sound of coughing, the rustle of limbs, all became part of the sleeping experience. When one person tossed and turned, everyone felt it. When one person had lice, soon everyone did. For women especially, the lack of privacy could be dangerous. Female servants and peasant girls were often placed in beds with male guests or employers, exposed to risks that were never spoken aloud. The vulnerability of shared beds extended beyond the physical into the deeply personal. Some wealthier households attempted to separate sleepers with curtains or screens, but even in castles, servants often slept on floor mats or shared chamber space. And nobility, the physical bed might have been more ornate, but the dynamics of shared space remained the same. And parasites knew no social class. Whether the sheets were rough linen or embroidered velvet, the insects beneath them were just as hungry. In fact, the thick layers and decorative bedding of the upper class often provided even more hiding places for bugs to nest and breed. Medical texts from the time offered little help. Remedies for itching and sores ranged from herbal ointments to prayers. Some families passed down techniques like boiling sheets in salt water or dusting the bed with ashes. But these efforts were rare and rarely effective. Most people simply accepted the discomfort as part of life. There is a certain tragedy in that acceptance, in the idea that rest, which should be healing, became another form of exposure. Another moment when the body was vulnerable, not just to others, but to the smallest, most persistent forms of suffering. Children learned to sleep through the itch. Parents grew accustomed to sores. Elderly relatives whispered blessings before bed, not for sweet dreams, but for protection against the things that crawled in the dark. Today, we speak of beds as personal, as private retreats. But for most of history, a bed was a communal object. It held bodies, secrets, illnesses, and insects. It was a place where the boundaries between people dissolved, and where the invisible world of parasites moved freely. So when you stretch out on your own bed, under your own blanket, remember this. There was a time when sleep was crowded, noisy, and alive with more than dreams. A time when the closeness of others brought both warmth and torment, and when the night was long, not because of fear, but because of the constant, quiet itch of too many bodies sharing too little space. Imagine drifting to sleep in a room filled with smoke. Not the kind from a candle or a small fireplace, but a thick, choking cloud that clings to your clothes and stings your eyes. This was not an accident. It was intentional. In the medieval world, smoke was one of the few weapons people had against the things that infested their beds. People believed that certain kinds of smoke could drive away insects and cleanse the space. They would burn herbs, animal dung, old rags, or even bones to produce heavy, acrid fumes. The idea was simple. If you could not wash your bed, you could smoke it. If you could not kill the parasite, you could at least chase them away with fire and stench. Fumigation was often done at night, just before sleeping. The bed would be exposed to the smoke for minutes or hours, depending on what was being burned. People waved smoking bundles beneath the mattress, stuffed smoke-soaked rags into the bedding, or placed smoldering bowls near their sleeping area. The herbs chosen were not random. Mugwort, sage, wormwood, and rue were favorite. These plants had strong scents and were believed to hold spiritual as well as practical power. In some households, a mixture of herbs was bound together with twine, lit at one end, and carried from room to room in ritual fashion. The goal was not only to repel insects, but to purify the soul and the air. But while the smoke might have temporarily repelled fleas, lice, and bedbugs, it introduced a new problem: the human lungs. The air in medieval homes was already thick. Poor ventilation, damp stone walls, and open fires made breathing difficult. Adding more smoke to the mix turned sleeping quarters into suffocating chambers. People coughed through the night, their chests tight, their throats raw. Children developed chronic wheezing. Elders grew weak with constant exposure. Many believed the smoke was healing. They saw coughing as a sign that the body was purging bad air or spirits. Some even welcomed the discomfort, thinking it meant the parasites were suffering more than. The truth, however, was different. Repeated exposure to smoke filled with toxic compounds weakened the respiratory system. Eyes burned, sinuses swelled, and still the bugs returned. The mattresses themselves absorbed the smoke, becoming saturated with its scent. The bedding took on the heavy aroma of charred herbs and ash. Clothes worn to sleep smelled of burnt leaves. Over time, the home carried the odor of smoldering desperation. There were other side effects too. Accidental fires were not uncommon. A single spark near dry straw or old cloth could turn a room into an inferno. Stories survive of entire homes reduced to ashes because someone tried to drive out pests with flame. And yet, despite the risks, people kept doing it because they had nothing else. In the countryside, families relied on burning dried cow dung or goat dropping. It was easy to collect and burn slowly. The scent was overpowering, but it was believed to be effective. In towns, people might use burning cloth soaked in vinegar or oil. Sometimes spices were added to improve the smell, but they only masked the bitter truth. Even monasteries and noble estates used smoke. Their methods were more refined, using censers and incense burners. But the principle was the same. Fill the space with smoke. Hope the bugs leave. Pray they do not return. In some homes, children were made to sleep directly beside smoldering bundles. Adults thought this would keep them safe through the night. But instead, it led to coughing fits and shallow breathing. Some babies were found feverish and red-eyed by morning. There were also symbolic reasons behind smoke rituals. Many believed that harmful spirits or bad energy could inhabit bedding. By filling the space with smoke, they were not just fighting insects, but cleansing the bed of invisible forces. It became a sacred act, not just a sanitary one. The irony is painful. In trying to reclaim rest, they made sleep harder. In trying to protect themselves, they poisoned the air they breathed. Smoke was not a solution. It was a substitute, a desperate act of control in a world that offered very little of it. And even when it worked, the effect was temporary. The bugs always came back. The smoke faded. The coughing remained. So when you light a candle tonight for comfort or scent, remember those who lit theirs in fear, who filled their rooms with smoke, hoping for a night of peace, and found only another kind of suffering. The battle for sleep was never clean. It was fought with fire, with ash, with breath that grew shallow. And in the end, it was not always clear who won. The night is cold. There is no firewood left. The wind slips through the cracks in the wall like invisible fingers. Outside, frost gathers on the earth, and inside, bodies huddle close for warmth. In many homes across medieval Europe, warmth did not only come from people, it came from animals. And in many beds, the family dog was not just a companion, it was a blanket with a heartbeat. Bringing animals into bed was not a luxury or a strange habit, it was survival. In peasant homes especially, dogs, chickens, goats, and even pigs might sleep indoors. In the coldest months, they often shared the same sleeping space as the humans who cared for them. The body heat of a dog or hen could mean the difference between a tolerable night and a freezing one. But warmth came with a cost. These animals did not come alone. They brought with them an entire ecosystem of pests. Fleas, ticks, mites, and lice lived in their fur and feathers. When the animals lay down beside humans, those parasites found new hosts. They crawled from animal to person with ease, biting, feeding, and staying behind. The medieval dog was not a clean creature. It roamed through fields, scavenged for scraps, fought with other animals, and rolled in filth. Its fur was thick with dust, dried mud, and hidden pests. When it curled at the foot of the bed, it left behind more than warmth. It deposited tiny intruders that nestled into straw and cloth, multiplying quietly in the dark. Chickens were even more problematic. In some rural homes, hens were allowed to sleep inside to protect them from predators. They perched on beams or nestled in baskets near the bed. Sometimes they wandered freely. Their feathers shed lice into the bedding. Their droppings, rich in bacteria, contaminated everything they touched, and their constant scratching stirred up dust that irritated lungs and skin. Cats, often praised for their ability to keep mice away, were not always better. Though they offered protection against rodents, they too carried fleas. They slept beside children, purred into ears, and twitched in their dreams. Meanwhile, their fleas fed quietly and laid eggs in the seams of blankets and mattresses. The idea of separate sleeping quarters for animals and people was not common. Barns were attached to houses. Animals came in during storms. Sick livestock were sometimes brought inside for care. In these moments, boundaries disappeared. The home became a barn. The bed became a nest. For children, the closeness of animals was often comforting. A puppy beside the pillow, a hen tucked under the arm. But as the child slept, their tender skin was exposed to parasites that caused rashes, infections, and sometimes disease. Many mothers brushed off the scratching and sores as nothing serious, but the suffering was real and often prolonged. Some people tried to prevent this by bathing their animals or rubbing them with herbs. But without modern knowledge of infestation cycles, these efforts did little. The bugs returned, and the cycle continued. In wealthier homes, animals were less likely to share beds, but they still roamed the chambers. Hunting dogs rested near the fireplace. Cats prowled beneath furniture. Birds in decorative cages shed feathers and dust. Even in silk-draped bedrooms, the tiny invaders moved freely. The presence of animals also contributed to the smell of the medieval bedroom. Wet fur, feathers, droppings, and sweat mingled into a scent that clung to every fabric. It was not considered unpleasant by many at the time. It was simply part of life. The smell of home was the smell of shared breath, shared skin, and shared parasites. Stories and poems from the period occasionally mention animals in bed with affection. A dog curled at the feet of a knight, a kitten warming a peasant's chest. These were not just sentimental images. They were reflections of reality. Companionship was not limited to the day. It followed people into the night. But what those stories rarely mention is what else followed. The things that bit in the dark. The scratching that began at midnight. The slow spread of bugs from tail to toe. Even today, some people share their beds with pets. But now, we have flea collars, vaccines, and baths. We vacuum. We wash. We know. In the Middle Ages, they did not. So next time you lie down beside your pet and feel the comfort that bond, remember those who did the same, but paid a higher price. For them, warmth came with crawling skin. Sleep came with scratching. And love, however deep, carried with it a trail of tiny biting feet. Imagine placing your head on a pillow after a long, cold day. You expect comfort, a moment of peace before sleep. But in the medieval world, that pillow was not what you think it was. It was not soft. It was not clean. And it was never, ever washed. Pillows in the Middle Ages were made from whatever materials people could afford or gather. For the poor, this often meant sacks filled with straw, grass, rags, or even moss. For the wealthy, it meant feathers, usually goose down, tightly packed inside cloth cases. But no matter the contents, the reality remained the same. Once a pillow was filled, it stayed that way. For years, sometimes for decades, there was no custom of removing the contents to clean them. There were no pillowcases that could be taken off and washed regularly. The idea of laundering a pillow would have sounded strange, even wasteful. Instead, pillows aged along with their owners. They absorbed years of breath, sweat, oil, and drool. They became heavy with the weight of human presence. Over time, these unwashed pillows became ecosystems. Dust mites multiplied in the warmth and darkness. Fleas laid eggs between the seams. Feathers grew moldy in damp conditions. And when a person lay down to rest, their face was pressed directly against this unseen world. For the poor, the situation was often worse. Their pillows were filled with coarse materials that broke down quickly. The straw would splinter. The rags would compress into hard lumps. Insects made nests within the fabric. Sometimes, the stuffing included bits of food, crumbs left from nights of eating in bed or feeding children. These crumbs attracted more pests. The pillow became not only dirty but alive. The smell was distinct. A mix of old cloth, sweat, mildew, and decay. No perfume or herb could mask it completely. People grew used to the scent. It was the smell of sleep, of home, of aging without interruption. In many homes, pillows were shared. A family might have one or two for everyone. Visitors used the same bedding as the household. Illness was passed from face to fabric, and from fabric to another face. In a time before germ theory, no one imagined that a pillow could be dangerous. But it was. Respiratory problems were common. Coughing, wheezing, and sore throats plagued families. Though the smoke from fires and poor ventilation played a role, the bedding contributed too. Mold spores from feathers, dust from wool, invisible mites that triggered reactions long before the cause was understood. Children often slept on the same pillow for years. Their small bodies breathed deeply into the fabric night to night. If they were sick, the pillow held traces of that sickness. If they had lice, the pillow became a nest. And because the fabric was rarely changed or exposed to sunlight, the infestation lingered. Even among the wealthy, cleanliness did not extend to the pillow. Feather beds and bolsters were signs of luxury, but they were still unwashed. The fabric might be embroidered, the feathers might be soft, but beneath the decoration was the same accumulation of time and biology. Some attempted remedies existed: beating the pillows with sticks, hanging them outside during festival, sprinkling them with lavender or vinegar. But these efforts were symbolic more than effective. They freshened the scent, but did not remove the filth. And yet, for all this, the pillow remained a precious item. It represented comfort in a hard world. To have a place to rest your head, however imperfect, was still something to value. People wrapped their arms around them, whispered secrets into them, died with them beneath their cheeks. But in doing so, they brought their vulnerability to a surface that never forgot. The pillow remembered every illness, every fever, every tear. It held them all in silence. Today, we wash our pillows. We replace them when they lose their shape. We worry about allergens and bacteria. We protect our skin and our lungs. But in the Middle Ages, none of this was possible. And every night, people rested their faces against something that looked like comfort, but was filled with quiet harm. So next time you fluff your pillow and breathe in its clean scent, think of the ones who never knew such a luxury, whose dreams began with the smell of age and ended with the itch of something hidden beneath the cloth. Their rest was not clean, but it was all they had. In a world where nothing came easy, even a bed had to be earned, and when a bed could not be built, it had to be passed down. In medieval Europe, second-hand bedding was not a backup option. It was the norm. People slept on mattresses, blankets, and pillows that had been used by others before them, sometimes for generations. A mattress was not something you discarded lightly. It took time, effort, and resources to create one. Even a simple straw-filled sack required materials that were not always easy to find. So when someone died, moved, or got married, their bedding was handed off to someone else. It might go to a sibling, a servant, or be sold at market. Along with it came every mark of its past. Used bedding carried more than wear. It carried stains, smells, and signs of sickness. But none of these things were considered deal-breakers. In fact, many people saw the history of a mattress as part of its value. A bed that had lasted for years was seen as sturdy and dependable. No one questioned what might still be living inside it. Markets offered second-hand goods of all kinds, including clothing, furniture, and bedding. It was not uncommon to see piles of rolled mattresses, folded blankets, and stuffed pillows for sale in the town square. Buyers would inspect them by sight and smell, but they had no way to detect the invisible guests still hiding in the seams. Fleas, bedbugs, lice, and mites did not disappear when ownership changed. They waited, tucked inside folds, buried in straw, nestled among feathers. When the new owner brought the mattress home, they brought the infestation with. Sometimes entire households would fall ill shortly after acquiring second-hand bedding. Skin rashes appeared. Children began scratching. People grew tired, irritable, restless. But the cause was rarely understood. The bed did not look dangerous. It looked familiar. It had served someone else. Surely it could serve again. Washing or disinfecting a mattress was not part of the process. At best, someone might air it out in the sun or sprinkle it with herbs. In wealthier homes, bedding might be dusted or beaten to remove debris. But the pests remained. The diseases remained. And so, with every handoff, the invisible history grew. In some cases, bedding came from strangers, soldiers who died in battle, travelers who never returned from their journeys, victims of plague or fever. Their possessions were taken, cleaned on the surface, and sold. The idea of spiritual contamination was feared by some, but the fear of poverty was greater. People needed beds, and they took what they could find. The emotional side of second-hand bedding cannot be ignored. To inherit a mattress from a parent or grandparent was often viewed as a blessing. It was a sign of continuity, of belonging. A newborn might be laid upon the same straw where their father once slept. A widow might rest her head on the pillow her husband had used. These gestures carried meaning. even if they also carried danger. Bedding also played a role in marriage. A bride might bring a mattress as part of her dowry. It was both a practical gift and a symbol of preparation for a new household. But that mattress was rarely new. It had seen life already, and it would see more. Sometimes bedding was reused in other ways. Torn blankets became baby wraps. Old pillows were cut open and their feathers transferred to new cases. Straw from flattened mattresses was burnt or composted. Every part had purpose, and nothing went to waste. But with every reuse came the risk of carrying something unwanted into a new space. There are historical accounts of people burning bedding during times of plague. In desperation, they set fire to entire sleeping chambers, hoping to purge whatever illness had taken hold. But those acts were rare and extreme. Most of the time, bedding was kept, reused, and passed on again. To sleep in a second-hand bed was to sleep in someone else's history. Their sweat, their dreams, their struggles. It was an intimate inheritance, one that shaped the experience of rest in ways both visible and hidden. Today, we view sleep as personal. We buy new mattresses wrapped in plastic. We read labels that promise protection from allergens and dust mites. But for much of history, sleep was a communal hand-me-down. It carried stories and secrets that could not be washed away. So when you stretch out in your clean bed tonight, think of the many who never had that privilege, whose sleep came wrapped in other people's memories, whose rest was never entirely their own, and whose comfort, however cherished, came with more than they ever knew. Imagine walking into a medieval bedroom. The air is thick, but not with dust or mold. Instead, it carries the sharp scent of lavender, the bitterness of wormwood, and the pungent trace of garlic. These smells were not for pleasure. They were a form of defense. In a time when people understood very little about bacteria, viruses, or parasites, they turned to what they could sense. Smells became symbols, scents became shields, and herbs, gathered from the wild or grown in small gardens, became essential tools in the nightly struggle against the unseen. Herbs were placed near pillows, tucked into bedding, or hung from the wooden beams above. Some were burned, others were crushed into pastes. Some were sewn into small pouches and worn around the neck while sleeping. These traditions blended practical attempts to repel insects with deep spiritual meaning. Lavender was among the most popular. Its calming aroma was thought to ease nightmares and reduce anxiety. But more importantly, it was believed to drive away fleas and lice. People would sprinkle dried lavender on the sheets or lay bundles beside their heads. It was a way to sleep with a little hope. Rue and wormwood had a more bitter, almost medicinal scent. These herbs were associated with purification and protection. In some households, they were placed in shoes or beneath the mattress. Some even believed they could prevent demonic visitations or keep away evil spirits during the night. Mint, sage, and rosemary were also common. They brought freshness to stale rooms and were believed to purify the air. Their strong oils masked the odors of unwashed bodies and musty bedding, making the act of lying down feel slightly more bearable. Garlic was used by some, though its strong smell made it less popular. Still, it was thought to be powerful. A clove might be placed beneath the bed or hung on the doorframe to ward off illness and misfortune. Beyond their physical properties, these herbs carried meaning. They were symbols of protection in a world full of danger. The act of placing herbs at the bedside was not just practical. It was emotional. It was a ritual. It was a way of saying, I am not helpless. In monasteries, herbs were part of the spiritual rhythm of life. Monks grew medicinal plants in their gardens and used them to treat both body and soul. Their cells often smelled of thyme and marjoram. These herbs were believed to help with breathing and digestion, easing the discomforts of daily life and sleep. In peasant homes, the use of herbs was passed down from generation to generation. Mothers taught daughters which leaves to gather, which roots to dry, and how to tie the bundles that would hang over the cradle or rest near the sick. Of course, the herbs did not eliminate the bugs. Fleas still bit, bedbugs still crawled. But in those moments between candlelight and sleep, the herbs gave people something to hold onto. A belief that they had done something, however small, to protect themselves and their families. There were even songs and prayers recited while preparing the herbs. These words gave voice to the fear that sleep might not bring peace, that something might slip beneath the blanket, that a dream might become a sickness. The herbs, then, were part of a greater ritual, a nightly act of defense against what could not be seen or named. Today, we light scented candles or spray our pillows with essential oils to create a calming space. We think of it as luxury, as comfort. But in the Middle Ages, scent was survival, a powerful signal to both the body and the mind that something had been done to keep the darkness at bay. The practice of placing herbs by the bed reminds us of a deeper human truth, that even in the most challenging times, people reach for what they can. They create meaning. They build habit. They try to make the night a little less frightening. So next time you catch the scent of rosemary or tuck lavender your pillow, remember the ones who did it first. Not for sleep alone, but for strength. Not just for fragrance, but for faith. Step inside a grand medieval chamber. The floor is made of polished stone. Tapestries hang from the walls, woven with gold thread and scenes of hunting or biblical tales. At the center of the room stands a magnificent bed. Its canopy stretches upward like a throne, draped in silk and velvet. Pillows are plump, sheets are embroidered. It looks like the very image of luxury. But looks can be deceiving, because beneath the layers of wealth and beauty, something is moving. Something small, something hungry. Parasites did not care about status. They did not distinguish between a peasant's straw mat and a nobleman's feather mattress. The difference was only in the packaging. If anything, the ornate beds of the rich provided even more shelter, more hiding places, and more opportunities for infestation. The grand beds of the upper class were made from carved wood, often with intricate details and deep grooves. These carvings, while beautiful, were the perfect hiding places for bedbugs. The canopy above, made from heavy drapes, collected dust and moisture. Insects could live within the folds of fabric, dropping onto the bed below when the time was right. Feather mattresses were prized for their softness, but they came at a price. Feathers, especially when not thoroughly cleaned, attracted mites and lice. They held in warmth and moisture, making the inside of a mattress a perfect place for parasites to nest. Once inside, they were nearly impossible to remove. The nobility also favored multiple layers of bedding. Woolen blankets, silk sheets, and fur-lined covers were stacked for comfort and status. But each additional layer meant another space for insects to hide and thrive. Cleaning was minimal. Changing the sheets was rare. And while servants were tasked with shaking out and beating the bedding, true sanitation remained out of reach. In the colder months, fur pelts were laid over the bed. These luxurious covers, often taken from foxes, bears, or wolves, were rarely washed. They brought a new ecosystem into the bedroom, complete with the remnants of the animal and whatever pests clung to it. Perfume was used to mask odors. Lavender sachets and rosewater were placed near pillows. But these efforts only concealed the problem. They did not solve it. A nobleman might rest his head on silk, but beneath that silk, bedbugs moved silently, waiting for darkness. Women of noble birth often spent hours in their chambers, sitting, reading, praying, or resting. Their exposure to the infested bedding was constant. Skin irritations were common. Hair was often covered not just for modesty, but to protect from lice that could transfer from bedding to scalp. Even the practice of dressing in the bedroom added to the risk. Clothes were stored near the bed or laid out across it. As they sat in place, parasites had time to crawl into sleeves, collars, and hems. When the garments were worn, the infestation followed. Servants were responsible for maintaining these rooms, but they themselves lived in conditions where pests were abundant. Their own clothes and bodies carried insects. The act of making the bed or fluffing a pillow could transfer bugs from one part of the house to another. Cleanliness was a performance, not a reality. There are records of noble families suffering from mysterious fevers, skin conditions, and insomnia. These were blamed on poor humors, bad air, or curses. Rarely did anyone suspect the bed itself. It was too beautiful to be guilty, too grand to be dangerous. Doctors and apothecaries prescribed ointments, tonics, and prayers. They spoke of rebalancing the body or calming the spirit. But the real culprit remained behind the curtain, beneath the pillow, inside the seams. The idea that wealth could shield someone from discomfort was a myth. The bed, no matter how lavish, was still a battlefield. And the enemies were not the kind that could be bribed or banished with gold. There were attempts to improve the situation. Some noble households aired their bedding in sunlight. Others ordered new mattresses every few years. But these were rare efforts, often more symbolic than effective. The cycle continued. In truth, the noble bed was a paradox. It symbolized power, comfort, and control. But it was also a place of vulnerability, where unseen forces undermined the illusion of safety. So the next time you see a picture of a medieval bed surrounded by beauty and splendor, remember what it concealed. Beneath the embroidery and silk lay the same reality as in every cottage and hut. A place of rest, tainted by creatures that did not care about class or coin. Luxury did not mean freedom from suffering. It only meant that the suffering wore finer clothes. There comes a point when no amount of beating, shaking, or smoking can save a mattress. When the scent of herbs has faded, when the bites no longer stop, and when sleep becomes unbearable, there is only one answer left: fire. In the medieval world, Burning a mattress was not a decision made lightly. It was a last resort, a desperate act, one that meant loss, labor, and often deep sorrow. But sometimes it was the only way to escape the infestation that had taken over every inch of the bed. Parasites had a way of making themselves permanent. Bedbugs burrowed into wooden frames, laid eggs in seams, and waited through weeks without feeding. Fleas nested deep in straw. Mites multiplied in feathers. The infestation grew slowly, then suddenly. What started as a few bites turned into restless, open sores, and infections that refused to heal. The household would try everything. Smoke from burning herbs, beating the bedding with sticks, washing the outer cloths if possible. But these efforts were often too little. The insects had already dug in. The bed had become their home, not yours. That was when fire was chosen. Sometimes it was done quietly. A mattress taken outside, torn open, doused with oil or wine, and set ablaze. Families watched as the flames consumed not just straw and cloth, but weeks or months of labor. They stood in silence as the smoke rose, knowing they would have to rebuild what was lost. Other times, the burning became a ritual, especially during outbreaks of disease. Beds were destroyed in groups. Whole households emptied their sleeping quarters into the street. Mattresses, blankets, pillows, even bed frames, all reduced to ash. It was an act of cleansing, both physical and symbolic, a final effort to stop the spread of illness that no one understood, but everyone feared. In some towns, authorities ordered these burnings. When plague struck, inspectors would mark infected houses. Bedding was removed by force. Fire carts rolled through the streets, carrying the remains of what had once been private and cherished. The smell of burning cloth, feathers, and wood filled the air. It was the scent of survival. In rural areas, the process was more intimate. A family might wait until dusk, then carry the mattress far from home. They would dig a pit or find an open field. There, they set it alight, praying that the flames would kill what they could not see. This act was not without risk. Fires spread quickly. In villages built with wood and thatch, one burning mattress could become a tragedy. Stories exist of homes lost, barns reduced to cinders, entire communities scarred by one moment of miscalculation. But the risk of not burning was often greater. The psychological impact was deep. A bed was not just a place to sleep. It was a place of rest, of dreams, of illness and recovery. To destroy it was to erase a part of the household. And yet, to keep it meant continuing to live with pain. People mourned their beds, especially the elderly, who had slept on the same mattress for decades. They watched it burn with tears in their eyes, knowing they might not see another like it. Children asked why their favorite blanket was gone. Parents whispered answers they barely understood themselves. Not everyone could afford to replace what was lost. After burning a bed, many families slept on floors, on straw laid bare, or on nothing at all. They rebuilt slowly, with borrowed cloth, scavenged stuffing, and hoped that the infestation would not return. The act of burning was also a statement, a refusal to surrender. In a world where control was rare, where sickness came without warning and pests invaded every corner, setting fire to the bed was one of the few things a person could do with certainty. It was a clean break, a fiery line drawn between what was and what must be. Today, we deal with infestations differently. We wash, we spray, we call professionals. But even now, when all else fails, people sometimes turn to fire. Mattresses are still thrown out. Homes are still cleared, and the feeling of helplessness remains. So when you lie in your clean bed tonight, remember those who could not, who watched the flames take what little comfort they had, and hoped the smoke would carry away the suffering too. Fire does not just destroy, it purifies, it resets. And in the medieval night, it was often the final, painful path back to peace. Open your eyes slowly. Feel the weight of the present returning. The bed beneath you is clean. The sheets smell of detergent, not sweat. The air is still. There is no scratching, no biting, no sound of chewing in the corners. You are safe. But not so long ago, sleep was a battlefield. For centuries, the night was not a place of comfort. It was a time of endurance. Lying down meant surrendering to an invisible world. One filled with crawling creatures, with itch and infection, with warmth that welcomed pests and fabric that trapped them. Rest was not guaranteed. Peace was never promised. You have traveled through a world where the bed was never just a bed. It was a nest, a trap, a place where the line between healing and harm blurred completely. The materials were crude. The hygiene was absent. The companions were often uninvited and hungry. We began in the straw and hay, where the very structure of the mattress welcomed life that should never have been there. You felt the tension of sleeping with rats at your feet, or worse, beside your face. You learned how fleas and bedbugs ruled the darkness, slipping through seams, feeding in silence, leaving behind trails of suffering. You saw how the human body left unwashed for days or weeks became a magnet for infestation, how clothes were worn in sleep not for modesty, but as armor. And even then, the armor failed. You entered the crowded bed, shared with family, with strangers, with animals. You witnessed how warmth came at a price, how ducks and chickens carried their own invaders. You breathed the smoke meant to cleanse, only to choke instead. You saw the pillows never laundered, thick with memory and mold. You discovered the haunting legacy of inherited mattresses, second-hand bundles of sorrow passed from one body to another. You inhaled the scent of herbs and prayers, desperate symbols of protection against what no one could name. You realized that even the nobility, wrapped in velvet and feather, could not escape the crawl of parasite. And finally, you watched it burn. You stood beside the flames as a mattress turned to ash, because nothing else worked. This journey was not just about parasites. It was about vulnerability, about how even the most intimate space can become dangerous when knowledge is missing and resources are few. It was about survival through discomfort, and the quiet heroism of those who endured every night without complaint. There is something deeply human about this story. The need to rest, the hope for safety, the small rituals people invent to protect themselves. A sprig of lavender, a whispered prayer, a blanket pulled up a little tighter. Each act, however small, became a way to push back against the darkness. And now, you return to a world of fabric softener, mattress protected, and central heating. You sleep alone, or with a loved one, in privacy and peace. The worst thing you might fear is a bad dream, not a living nightmare waiting beneath your sheets. But perhaps you will never see your bed the same way again. Perhaps the next time you pull up your covers, you will remember them. The mother who tucked her baby close, hoping the fleas would bite her instead. The boy who scratched his arms until they bled, not knowing why. The elder who whispered into the straw, not for sleep, but for mercy. You will remember that sleep was once an act of courage, and that rest, like freedom, was something hard won. So sleep deeply tonight. Breathe slowly. No one is watching you from the cracks. No one is waiting in the seams. The war has ended, and you are on the other side. But never forget the battles fought beneath linen and wool, beneath hay and feathers, beneath silence. Because for a long time, the night belonged not to the dreamer, but to the things that crawled quietly beside them.